Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video, we're back with another review of the latest season of The Amazing Race. This time talking about The Amazing Race 37, a season that felt mostly like a direct follow-up on The Amazing Race 35, which was the first season filmed intentionally for 90-minute episodes, and I think this season just, again, kind of does that, but maybe slightly better, if not like around the same, where, again, I think this is a solid season of The Amazing Race, though still a season that, again, doesn't really live up to old school Amazing Race, definitely not a season that lives up to most of the other reality shows currently going on, but still a solid season that we'll be running through my opinions on, running through the season from beginning to end, starting it off with the premiere, where it's a pretty typical intro initially, where we see a starting line at the Museum of Motion Pictures, where they're all in front of Phil, and they all introduce themselves, with us getting introduced to this season's theme, that being the season of surprises, aka there being a somewhat twist, aka there essentially being a twist every week, bring back some of the most iconic game pieces, which I felt like was a weird description of these things, but still, really just an excuse to bring back, again, things like U-turns, intersections, fast forwards, other aspects of the show that had been missing for a bit, and I did actually really like this. I think this is a nice ramification for the 90-minute episodes. Obviously, 90 minutes kind of forces them to have a little bit more juice in every leg, and I think that's a major reason why they decided to go with this sort of format, and I think, again, it worked mostly well, where, again, I thought a lot of these things were very cool to see back, even though, again, some of them didn't really have as much of an impact as others. But also here we get the reveal that we have 14 teams, the most ever. Which, again, playing off the last few seasons where there's no non-elim legs, which, again, I've always been an advocate for. I thought that was a nice addition there. While we also get the introduction to the first twist of the season. The twist for this leg, which is the fork in the road. Which, I mean, I'll talk about the twist properly a bit later, but it is essentially a double elimination twist where two people will be going out in this first round, which obviously now makes it clear why it's the biggest cast ever. Though I'll also say, a bit questionable to do that in the first leg. I never particularly liked having people be kind of screw over in that light in the first leg, and I guess to be fair, for them, it's like saving money. They don't have to follow around another team for longer in the race, but I think for me personally, I would have saved double elim for a bit later in the season. But really, this fork in the road twist doesn't even come into play until the tail end of the leg. Though at least, again, they did give them warning here, so at least there's that. But anyway, the first location they had to fly to ends up being Hong Kong, where everyone ends up getting into marked cars and has to drive to LAX, with Carson and Jack being introduced here. Again, a very typical modern Amazing Race team, one that comes off very affable, while also very capable, and I felt like from the offset, it felt like they were very clear frontrunners to go on to win the season. But really, despite that, like most of the teams end up arriving at the airport around the same time anyway, though we do see that the flights themselves are an hour apart. And again, surely that hour will definitely matter, but we do see Jonathan and Anna, Carson and Jack, Melinda and Erica, and Courtney and Jasmine get on the first flight, which I was like, very weird that only 4 teams were allowed on the first flight while 10 teams get on the second flight. Again, that definitely felt a bit much. Really, none of this matters as everyone catches up to each other anyway. But during this sequence, we obviously get introduced to a few more of the teams. We get Nick and Mike coming off very affable, talking about having applied for 6 years and being so excited to be here, with us even like seeing their audition tapes, which again made them very likable. Definitely felt like a team that would be very strong in the race, though they kind of come off as a disaster. Also, we get introduced to Scott and Lori, who have 8 sons, and they definitely won't mention their kids over and over and over again on the season. And also, we get introduced to Mark and Larry, who are best friends, who call themselves broke rednecks that have never been out of the country, though have driven around it in motorcycles. Surely that experience will definitely help them. Anyway, they all get to Hong Kong, where they have to take a ferry to Changchao Island, where we do end up seeing Jonathan and Anna breaking off from the other people in the first flight, to where they end up getting on the first ferry alone, really showing them being these like massive frontrunners early on, taking a pretty massive lead in this first leg, and really coming off as this like super competitive team where we do get their introduction, with them kind of coming off like kind of pseudo Colin and Christy light. Now again, not obviously as intense as Colin, but definitely like a modernized version of that, to where we also get their introduction, talking about they're obviously married, but hadn't separated for a year, and they watched Amazing Race together. That was their gateway to start chatting again, which, I mean, you couldn't pick a better show. But either way, the other teams from the first flight end up having to wait 30 minutes for next ferry, to which most of the other teams from the other flight end up catching up somehow. Again, they were an hour behind. I don't know how they caught up here, but anyway, Jonathan and Anna end up being the first to arrive at the roadblock, which has them having to climb up this like bamboo tower, and they decide to let Anna do it, considering they have a massive lead, which again, probably optimal strat there, though these two are struggling, specifically because it's raining, which definitely would have made this pretty brutal to do, but again, ends up getting it anyway, leading to them having to now take another ferry, to where we see them waiting for the next ferry all while the other teams end up arriving at the roadblock and finishing it relatively quickly and catching back up to Jonathan and Anna, to where, which again makes most of the leg up to this point pretty pointless. It's literally almost all the teams are together at that point, but we do get some interesting moments on the roadblock with like Pops being able to climb up the entire tower, not even using his feet, which is pretty insane, which I believe was because he had a foot injury. But so we do get a lot of hyping up of Pops about how in shape he is for being 64. Oh, well, Brett ends up being the first to finish. Other people from the second grouping, to which we then get an introduction to with them having been together for 10 years and being circus performers, with again, it's just fully fitting into the type of thing that he would be able to do. And in general, Brett and Mark felt like a team that should have been poised for success on this season, where I remember looking at them as like one of my top picks for a potential winner pick. Yeah, again, just something just never really clicked with them on the race. But while almost every team is together waiting for the ferry, we see one team being particularly far behind, that being Jackie and Lauren, who felt like a team just not really poised to do well in the Amazing Race. To where we do get this pretty big segment about how like Jackie has a fear of stairs, after having fallen downstairs, needed surgery before, to where we just get this pretty over-the-top moment for overcoming her fears, which again, nice moment for her, along with the fact that we also get them once again struggling at the roadblock as well, to which we get like heroic music playing for them. And then eventually getting in, saying that this is their Amazing Race moment. This is what they came for. Which felt very spoilery that they would say something like that midway through the premiere. Where again, should have made it even more clear they were gone. But again, I do love how they follow this up by saying it's a tortoise in the hare, because surely they're going to catch up to the other teams. At the same time, we do have seen Courtney and Jasmine also struggling here, but in a different way, where they end up struggling to find a taxi, constantly getting people to stop, but they'll tell them no, which did feel very weird. And I was thinking initially, like, this is racially motivated, though it does seem like their issues stem from the fact that they were showing the wrong instructions. They were showing the taxi drivers location in English when they were given in Chinese, specifically to tell taxi drivers where to go. And again, it felt like just kind of a rookie mistake there, but it does put them relatively far behind as we head into the fork in the road, where we get the reveal that they have to pick which route they want to take to the pit stop, where again, with there being 14 teams, only 7 can do each side, essentially creating 2 races where last place from each side gets eliminated, which I personally think is a cool concept. Again, having 2 races at the same time. We saw this kind of happen on Amazing Race Australia, though it was portrayed a bit differently, where it was over the course of 2 episodes and 2 completely different legs, where US handles it in a bit of a more underwhelming way. And I would say in general, I think that is my big criticism of this twist here, is the fact that it is essentially just pick a detour, and the last person to check in that did that detour is eliminated. And again, I think that's kind of lame. I personally would have rathered them doing the fork in the road from earlier on in the race. I think that would have been a lot more interesting to me, because essentially this just makes the entire leg come down to the one task. But beyond that, I think there is actually some like interesting strategy involved with this, and the fact that you can actually see who the other people are that picked that specific detour, and you can change your plans accordingly. Though through that, I actually think it actually comes off a bit unfair for certain teams. Again, for teams that are up in front, it obviously makes them pick their detour here with less information. They don't know who they're competing against. So people that go later are obviously able to plan around this, see what teams they're competing against, see who's on the other side. And again, I think that is something that definitely feels a tad unfair from this. Also, the fact that we do end up seeing most of the early teams here picking the dance side of the detour, which in essence actually gives them a disadvantage. The fact that most of the higher placing teams are going for one specific detour, that they'll have tougher competition there. And I think that is something that, again, also disfavors the teams that picked earlier as well. And I think just in general, again, it's a twist that feels a tad unfair from that light. But again, I think it also adds interesting strategy to the race that, again, I always like seeing strategy being utilized in the Amazing Race. But also, again, it's just the issue that is just kind of lame, that everything just comes down to this detour, and that's really it. But again, it's an interesting concept I just wish was a bit tweaked if we were to ever get it back. But either way, the detour ends up being between dance and sing, where again, most end up picking dance, which is literally just them doing a lion dance, which felt relatively easy. While sing has them having to sing in Cantonese and also learn a dance. It's like, okay. And very clearly, the dance task was a lot easier here than the sing task, which is obviously why a lot of the early teams go for it. But to be fair, again, in a fork in the road situation, that ultimately doesn't really matter that much. Especially in a spot where, again, you have a team like Jackie and Lauren who are so far behind, to which it essentially ends up making it so that the people that end up being on the detour that doesn't fill up with 7 people first end up essentially having an automatic bye during this leg, considering Jackie and Lauren are just clearly going to come in last there, which is, again, kind of also a lame aspect. But anyways, during this where we get our introduction to Alyssa and Josiah, who come off as a very affable couple here, with Alyssa being propped up as the brains while Josiah's propped up as the clown. But again, it felt like a very like DX and Claire coded relationship here, and where they were actually my winner picks coming into season, but they end up being the first to end up picking Sing, which again at that point, very good strat considering so many other teams had picked the other Detour, to where we end up seeing Jonathan and Anna do a similar strat here. Oh, we see Courtney and Jasmine coming in second to last and end up picking Dance because they see that Mark and Larry are there and they think they can beat them, which again is this massive advantage for a team coming in later. But again, the Dance teams end up finishing way earlier here. Oh, well, listen, Josiah ended up winning for the Sing group despite coming in 5th technically. And then we end up seeing Jonathan and Anna come in second for their side, though we see Jonathan being pissed, saying that this isn't good enough, which again felt very old school Amazing Race coded. But on the Dance side, it ultimately comes down to Courtney and Jasmine and Mark and Larry, with both finishing around the same time. And along with that, we see Nick and Mike struggling to get a taxi, leading to them kind of having a mini meltdown, which is pretty apt, and we kind of see that every leg from this point forward. But it ends up being a foot race between these three teams, which ultimately, again, Mark and Larry being the older guys here, end up losing that. Oh, well, every Sing team ends up finishing before Jackie and Lauren even arrive, to where while we do get some focus on like some teams getting lost at a pit stop, and there's some shuffling in placements because of it. Again, obviously Jackie and Lauren were coming in last there, which again was kind of a ho-hum elimination there, where obviously the more interesting one was the Mark and Larry one, which I know some people were talking about how like Mark and Larry were screwed, and where had this been like a straight up just normal double elimination, is Mark and Larry necessarily getting second to last? Again, not entirely sure, but also I don't think you can fully say they're entirely screwed, just because of the fact that, again, I think most teams would have probably picked Dance had they actually had a genuine choice between the two. Again, most people only pick Sing because it is the fork in the road twist, where, again, it just felt like Dance was just clearly the way easier task here. And in that world, I think most teams end up leapfrogging Mark and Larry anyway, to where, again, obviously it's just a spot where I would not necessarily say they're entirely screwed by specifically this twist, and I think they're probably just more so screwed by the fact that there was a double elimination at all. But again, with that, we'll talk about the two boots, starting it off with Mark and Larry, who were fine. Again, we obviously didn't get much of them. They seem like a pretty comedic presence, to where I'm sure if they had stayed on the show, they would have had some pretty funny confessionals here and there. But obviously, again, they just didn't last that long. Didn't even get that much focus in the premiere here either, to where they're a team that didn't really seem to be doing much wrong. They just, again, seem to be just one of the slowest teams, just naturally, to where ultimately they just end up kind of going out unceremoniously here. Oh, well, we also lose Jackie and Lauren, who, again, just never felt poised to do well in the Amazing Race, though, again, at least got their moments, again, had these like big OTT moments on the show. But again, at least they came off as likable, but again, just a team that was just kind of dead in the water from the very beginning. And really, the fork in the road kind of saved us from having just like absolutely no suspense in the back portion of the episode. But with that, we get to episode 2, which has them flying to Osaka, though we do learn that the departure times for this leg end up being based around when they finished the previous leg, which again, normally, perfectly fine, obviously. But again, I do think with this fork in the road twist in play, this is kind of dumb, as it really just ended up favoring the teams that picked Dance, as again, that was just a way easier task. Obviously, most of those people end up leaving first, but ultimately, again, it doesn't matter. But again, we do actually get some airport drama, kind of, where players are told to book their own flights. So where we do see Carson and Jack ending the first flight here that they end up getting on board alongside Brett and Mark and Ernest and Bridget. That arrives 30 minutes earlier in the second flight. So considering there's an odd number, that doesn't really matter. Considering we also get a later intersection, which ends up being the twist for the episode, which again would fundamentally screw over one of the teams. But anyway, we do get personal content here from Ernest and Bridget, talking about how he used to be authoritarian, but now they're friends. And we see Bridget doing a rap that he taught her when she was a kid. That was kind of cringy. So again, I wonder what their uptick in the edit signifies. But yeah, we get most teams getting on flight 2, with us even seeing like Pops and Jeff and Melinda and Erica being able to talk their way onto the flight. Oh, well, we see Scott and Lori and Bernie and Kerrigan and them getting left behind, with Bernie and Kerrigan getting to this pretty massive argument here over whether or not they even try to get on the better flight, and they end up not, and they end up just like yelling at each other in the middle of the airport, which was again kind of funny to see, and really nice to see some inner team drama on Modern Amazing Race, which again I feel like we don't typically see anymore. Anyway, the flights end up arriving where Ernest and Bridget are the first to the intersection, which again is happening very early on in the leg, in a spot where I'm just kind of fine with the intersection here. I mean, again, if they're going to bring back all these old twists, have one per episode, the intersection's like not a terrible pick, but one that, again, doesn't really have that big of an impact in the grand scheme of things. So while I do like the idea of forcing teams to work with others, I also do think it obviously just like opens up for people being kind of screwed by who they end up being partnered with, as we see here, where we end up seeing Ernest and Bridget being paired up with Brett and Mark, while Carson and Jack have to wait until the next flight arrives, which finally ends up actually being better for them, where they only end up being intersected for this roadblock here, which is, again, another lame aspect of it. Where, again, I think if you're going to utilize this twist, at least actually make it stick for longer than just this one task. But anyway, it has them just having to play taiko drums, and we waste time on the show just showing entire performance from the professionals for some reason. But either way, Ernest really ends up struggling here and Ridley blows the lead for them, with Mark saying that he doesn't know how to motivate Ernest, which I was like, considering this was during the airing of Challenge All-Stars Rivals, this did feel very Frank-coded. Although Carson Jack and being paired up with Jonathan and Anna, to which they end up leaving in first. Although we also see Scott and Lori and Bernie and Kerrigan, again, coming in last due to their last flight. They'll end up blowing through everybody here and passing a good chunk of teams. Anyway, the teams then have to go to Dotonbori Bridge, which, hey, I know about this from Yakuza. Kind of. I mean, technically they changed the name and city, but again, you get the point. Anyway, the detour here is a choice between Mochi and Mawashi, where Mochi has them preparing mochi balls, while Mawashi has them having to put on sumo wear and then push a sumo wrestler out of the way, which felt very ridiculous. But really, almost every team ends up doing Mawashi here, where, again, inherently that definitely feels like the easier task here. Again, you just putting on sumo wear, though obviously you have to put it in a precise way that makes it a tad difficult here. But either way, we get focused on Anna, talking about how it's their 7th anniversary and they're trying to run a good race today, and what do you know, they come out in first and win the leg. Oh, we do see Scott and Lori have a miraculous 2nd place finish here, which is, again, pretty mind-blowing considering they were on the last flight, and again, really just showing how strong of a team they are. But we do end up seeing Pops and Jeff, Courtney and Jasmine, Melinda and Erica do the mochi task. Let's getting a personal segment from Pops and Jeff talking about how this task was made for them because they're used to splitting wood, I guess, and what do you know, they struggle here with them making the balls too big, though ultimately, again, they don't end up being that far behind from it. To where we, on the other side of things, we do end up seeing Nick and Mike constantly getting no's and getting frustrated as expected, to where they do ultimately end up landing in 10th place, which their actual placement is not really explained. But also we do have getting some fighting between Han and Holden, with them like struggling to get a taxi, getting bickering between two, along with them also bickering at the sumo task. So ultimately the leg does come down to Han and Holden, Ernest and Bridget, to where it is edited to be extremely close, though again I thought it was pretty apparent that Ernest and Bridget were going home here, which ends up ultimately being the result, to where, and we lose Ernest and Bridget, who were fine. Again, not a major focus on the show. They did seem to have a pretty good first leg, to where they did end up finishing towards the top of the pack, though obviously their second leg here was a bit of a disaster, really mostly because of that intersection, to where, to be fair, again, Mark and Brett end up recovering from that, while Ernest and Bridget couldn't. Are probably one of these teams that only have a specific sort of skill set, to where once they're given a pretty bad task, it's going to be pretty hard for them to recover, to where, again, they were purely affable here, but just a team that did not really bring too much to the show. But then we get to episode 3, where we get them having to take a bullet train to Kyoto, with a lot of focus on how cool bullet trains are, because that was definitely need to make the edit. We also get them learning that Express Pass will be available at some point during the leg, which I, again, don't remember Amazing Race history well enough, but I did think this was actually a cool thing to add here. I mean, obviously, again, Express Pass has been a constant amongst Amazing Race, but I feel like typically in the US version, it's given out just to the team that comes in first during a specific leg, to where I felt like this time them handing it out mid-leg was a nice change of pace here. But anyway, the first task has them going to a shrine where they put a piece of paper into water and decipher a message, which is a mostly lame task, though. There's like a little fun aspect of it, the fact that water could dry out and then you wouldn't be able to see the message and you have to go back. So we see Courtney and Jasmine in particular struggling because of that. But either way, Jonathan and Anna are the first at a roadblock, which ends up being a seemingly easy task of them having to keep a soccer ball in the air through 5 passes. Though this is where the Express Pass is up for grabs, with the reveal that the Express Pass goes to the first team that is able to have both of their members complete the roadblock, which again, I really like this addition here. I thought this was a nice way of introducing this. The fact that, again, if you want the Express Pass, you're going to have to waste time, which again adds this like risk-reward dilemma, especially when we see multiple teams going for it at the same time. Now, realistically, I would prefer it more through doing a completely different task, considering the budget constraints of Amazing Race US, and also the fact that, again, this is just so easy to do. It's literally just at the same location. You just have them doing literally the exact same thing with, again, no real addition to the budget. I did feel like, again, this was a cool way to be adding the Express Pass to the game. But this does lead to some drama here between Jonathan and Anna, where Jonathan ends up getting it right away, though Anna ends up struggling here, with Jonathan, again, just coming off as a dick, saying that I'm not going to try to smile when you're having a hard time with something so simple, which, again, just came off very dismissive. And this is all while Scott and Lori end up deciding to not try for the Express Pass, being able to leave him first and really just holding the lead from that point on, all while we see Anna eventually getting it, to which Jonathan and Anna get the express pass, which they will surely use well. But ultimately, we do have seen Courtney and Jasmine and Bernie and Kerrigan really struggling on the soccer task, which ends up putting them in the back of the pack, while Hun and Holden end up actually coming to task last, but end up leapfrogging them. But this all leads to personal content for Courtney and Jasmine, which again made it feel kind of clear that they were the ones being set up to be eliminated in this spot. Anyway, Scott and Lori arrive at the detour, which is a choice between fold it or fling it. Fold it being them having to kill the giant origami figure, while fling it has them having to hit targets using different style of weapons and having to not miss a single shot, which is just insane to where obviously no one ends up finishing that. And again, felt like probably one of the most brutal tasks on The Amazing Race. Just feels like something they made like pretty much impossible, which again, I don't know if that was intentional, and we do actually end up seeing most teams actually trying it to where it actually ends up leading to this leg essentially being determined by how quickly you end up giving up on the fling it task, with certain teams giving up right away while other teams taking a while to end up moving on. But anyway, Scott and Lori end up finishing here first and winning the leg, while Carson and Jack end up getting second really out of nowhere, while Jonathan and Anna get third, which is again very impressive for them considering the fact that they also got the express pass along the way. Also, I did love how like during the origami task, we do see Anna saying that her daughter loves origami and her daughter would be proud, which is again funny considering they picked the other detour first. But also along the way, we end up seeing Pops and Jeff get lost on the way to a detour, with Melinda and Erica ending up helping them out, with us seeing an alliance between the two because they have the parent-child connection. If only that alliance really mattered. Anyway, they end up helping each other through the origami task. Always see Alyssa and Josiah again sticking to the fling it task for a bit too long, giving up after 19 attempts. Always see Nick and Matt have their typical meltdown after actually doing well initially at the throwing task, only for them to ultimately still not be good enough and end up switching after 30 attempts, which is pretty insane. So we end up seeing Nick and Mike and Hun and Holden work together to, again, at this point, just attempt to survive, even though we do actually finally see both of the teams arguing within each other, while the other teams are trying to focus, which is a funny little moment. But ultimately, again, it comes down to Bernie and Kerrigan and Courtney and Jasmine, and it's a spot where Bernie and Kerrigan actually, again, waste time at the fling it task and actually end up starting the origami task last, but ultimately still finish before Courtney and Jasmine. Courtney and Jasmine obviously getting eliminated here. And Courtney and Jasmine's another team, again, very affable team, very likable, obviously got a lot of personal content over the course of the last 3 episodes. However, again, sadly, just not that good of a team. Again, very much struggled at almost every task, had a lot of navigational issues as well, to where, and just not a team that seemed particularly suited for The Amazing Race, but still a likable team, and one that I'll probably remember more so for the fact that one of them sounds exactly like Aisha Welch, and can get that out of my head throughout watching this season. But either way, didn't bring too much to the show. But anyway, we get to episode 4 where we see them having to fly to Bali now, with almost every team getting on the same flight, which was kind of lame, with only Bernie and Kerrigan missing the flight, only for them to have a equalizer the following morning anyway. Forget all that was very pointless, though. Again, they end up ultimately leaving at designated times based on their arrival, where they have to drive an ATV through a cave and through a waterfall, which again gets really hyped up in the show. It's such a cool task, when it was, again, it's just kind of fine. But also, we're not even told like how much of a lead each team ended up having, which I assume is probably because like it was not much to where, again, all this felt like kind of pointless from a race perspective. But anyway, we get some weird content along the way as well, like Jonathan saying that he's living out his fantasy of being Indiana Jones and like puts on an Indiana Jones sort of hat. For some reason, that was very random. Like, is Indiana Jones driving ATVs through caves? Carson and Jack also end up comparing this to Mario Kart, which, I guess, just the fact that you're driving an ATV, which is even a go-kart, and all this was so weird. On the way to the next task, we end up seeing Brett and Mark end up getting lost and somehow get 43 minutes out of the way, only for that to somehow not matter at all on this leg, which is just genuinely insane. But anyway, we have them having to go to a rice field where we get the reveal of the next twist of the season, that being the driver's seat. A new twist that allows for first team to get there to determine how much work the other teams have to do during the roadblock, which I actually really like this twist in concept. Again, I don't think it was, again, handled the greatest here. But again, I think conceptually this is a cool concept. It's something that's just easy to do for The Amazing Race that doesn't really increase the budget. It's still the same location. It just makes certain teams have to be there for longer. Oh, it's something that, again, gives agency to that first place team. Now, I will also say, kind of a disadvantage, especially considering the later U-turn vote, which definitely puts a massive target on Jonathan and Anna's back, who are the people that end up doing this here. As again, they're essentially deciding on how much rice each team has to collect in a spot where most teams are going to be delegated with the worst of 25 pounds, which I do think that is something that's a tad unfair here. Again, it really just makes it so that the person in the driver's seat gets essentially screwed over because they're pissing off like half the remaining teams, actually making this probably even worse to utilize than a U-turn for your social capital, as you're just going to have more teams against you because of you using this. Ultimately, I also don't feel like Jonathan and Anna use this effectively, where they end up making some pretty rash decisions. A lot of them don't really making sense, to which obviously they end up giving themselves the lowest amount here, as you would expect, but also then proceed to give like Bernie and Kerrigan 25 pounds, again, the highest amount, which is like, you're essentially dooming them by doing so. All like giving Carson and Jack 20, again, the middle amount, which is like, again, they're one of the strongest teams, and which, I mean, to be fair, they do start the leg in 9th place, or they are pretty far behind, but again, that definitely felt like a very questionable decision, along with the fact that they then start to do the task and then instantly give up on it and use their express pass, which is a ridiculous move here. Again, obviously they end up winning that express pass the previous leg. They were in a pretty good position with it. Or this is just really a massive waste of utilizing it here. Again, you already have this massive advantage here. You're out in first before any of the other teams end up arriving, and you have the smallest amount of rice you have to collect, to where, again, to use your express pass in this position is essentially wasting this advantage you were just given. And it also just further pisses off the other teams, considering you took the smallest amount and now essentially burned it, which, to be fair, again, is the correct strategic call. Again, it would still lead to the other teams being further behind, which would make it more likely that you go on the win. But again, just not the right usage of express pass here. And the show really ends up scolding them for this. We get constant confessionals from Carson and Jack talking about how stupid this was. And considering also other teams' bitterness towards them for their decisions, it just felt pretty clear they were going to be voted in by the U-turn vote the following episode. But it really actually doesn't even buy them that much to use this, as they do end up seeing Lori really just blowing through task anyway, where they end up being almost tied for first either way. But also Scott and Lori end up getting a pretty massive edit during this section and being very upset the fact that they were given the highest amount because they're old, saying that Jonathan and Anna gave themselves 15, which doesn't help anyone but them, which is like, no shit. And this again leads to this other content about other teams talking negatively about Scott and Lori, talking about how much they're hamming this up and how they're just as big of threats. Which again, it just also felt like very clear setup to them being targeted at the following vote. We do see them eventually getting to the detour, which has them going to the cleanest village in Bali, I guess. But they have to choose between having to decorate a pole that they then have to carry and put on display, or recreating a headdress that they have to transfer to a temple. Both relatively boring tasks here. I did feel like the headdress task here was way more difficult, considering, again, both of them involved like memorization, recreating something, but the headdress task also involved you having to get the fruit that you use for it yourself, which I assume they also didn't supply them more money to do it either, and it just felt like a net negative there, the fact that you're wasting your money on it, and the fact that you have to actually go and find these items and still recreate it after that and still deliver it. So again, I don't know why anyone picked that task, but it did seem like certain teams did. But Jonathan and Anna do the poll task, with Jonathan having to go pee and then complains about it, and then goes pee because that needed to make the edit. So I did find it weird that Anna was still able to work on this while Jonathan was going peeing, because I know there's like a certain rule that you can't get too far away from your partner, to where the show tries to make this like as if it's a big deal of Jonathan having to go pee. But again, if Anna didn't have to stop working on the task, then like, who cares? Just let him go pee. Anyway, Scott and Lori end up arriving almost immediately afterwards, where you get some tension between the two teams, with Scott saying that he's going to treat Jonathan and Anna like his kids when they do something bad and just ignore them. Because if you didn't know, Scott was a dad. But either way, Jonathan and Anna still end up finishing first here, end up winning the leg. Though again, get a lot of talk about how they made the wrong move, which, I mean, in retrospect, again, would they have won the leg if they did not use Express Pass? Likely not, considering how much time Scott and Lori seem to make up here. But again, it's definitely not guaranteed, considering Scott and Lori don't even come in second, where despite the fact that they leave the detour second, somehow Carson and Jack pass them, which again just really comes out of nowhere, and is also a pretty incredible comeback considering they started the leg in 9th. And again, to be fair, obviously them having less to do at the fork in the road definitely benefited them there, but even then they left that in 6th, where again they definitely had a pretty solid leg here. But again, if Jonathan and Anna didn't utilize their express pass, do they come in first here? Not necessarily, but also, did you need to come in first? Again, I think there were just way better times to be utilizing their express pass, like the following episode. But again, this ends up being another disastrous leg for Bernie and Kerrigan, where they were in last to begin with. They then end up leaving the rice task in last, them having to do the highest amount. Also, we see them getting lost on the way to the detour, or even see Carson giving them instructions on where to go, only for them to just not listen to him. Again, them remaining lost and getting into another fight here, both in the race and also in confessional, which should have been very telling. The fact that they clearly were sad in the confessional felt very clear they were getting eliminated here. But once again, we end up seeing Hunter and Holden and Nick and Mike end up working together, do the headdress task for some reason, where again they end up having struggles. Hunter and Holden putting it together to begin with, while Nick and Mike end up dropping their headdress, which didn't seem like they had to recreate it after they dropped it. Which again, fair as they recreate it to begin with, but this is more so just about delivering it, but again, still a tad questionable. But ultimately, this leads to a lot of teams finishing the detour at once, all running towards the pit stop at the same time. Again, Nick and Mike, Hunter and Holden, Alyssa Josiah, Brett and Mark, with, again, Brett and Mark just out of the blue being back with the other teams after losing so much time earlier. But again, they end up running together, to which they end up accidentally running around in a circle, which was kind of funny, which actually leads to Melinda and Erica leapfrogging all of them. But either way, they still all finish, and Bernie and Kerrigan end up being in last as expected. And again, I liked Bernie and Kerrigan on the show. Again, a team that I think I was expecting to do a bit better, especially considering they had a pretty decent first leg, but it kind of just crumbles around them following that. And again, just felt like a team that was ripe for personal conflict. We saw them fighting so often, which also, again, brought a breath of fresh air to the season. Where I feel like we haven't really seen a lot of like real inter-team drama in Modern Amazing Race, so it was at least nice to see something there between the two. But again, didn't feel like a team that was poised to make it too deep, where again, them going out in this episode was just kind of expected. But over episode 5, which ends up probably being one of my favorite episodes of the season, one that does start off with them being told to go to a monkey forest sanctuary, where we get the reveal that there's going to be a live double U-turn vote, which, why do it at the sanctuary? Why not just do it at the pit stop? I don't think this made any sense. Again, it feels very strange they made them literally travel all the way to this monkey sanctuary just for there to be an equalizer, and then later reveal that there was the U-turn vote, which I guess, to be fair, we got at least like some interactions between the teams as they were waiting, and we get to see like Lori confronting Jonathan and Anna about the driver's seats, with her saying, I don't hold a grudge, only for her to kind of hold a grudge. And you also see Carson and Jack thanking Jonathan and Anna for helping them the previous leg, which again will surely go somewhere. Also, we get personal content here for both Scott and Lori and Anna and Jonathan, where again, I wonder where that'll go. But again, it ends up being very sympathetic content, with Anna opening up about having an atomic pregnancy and saying that Jonathan was the perfect partner, which I did feel like this was very strange content considering what we later see with Jonathan. But anyway, we have Phil arriving saying that 2 teams will get a monkey on their back, which felt like maybe the only reason they decided to go to a monkey sanctuary is just so you can make that analogy. But either way, we get a live double U-turn vote, which we had previously seen on Amazing Race 31 back here, and I do think they improved it. I mean, this is a spot where again, I always had criticism of the Amazing Race 31 format, where they just openly said their vote, in a spot where they could obviously change their vote based on what the previous votes were. This time, they made them write down their votes in secret and then reveal them 1-to-1. Again, definitely a much better format there. And in general, I did like having the return of the W turn vote here, again, adding a social strategy aspect to the game and adding a little spice of social strategy into the game, with it also providing for some great drama across this episode, and the fact that both Jonathan and Anna and Scott and Lori, 2 of the best teams on the season, are racing between each other to survive, which again, I thought made for great TV, even though again, obviously a tad manufactured. But again, the way that this vote ends up being handled is that the top 2 vote getters end up being U-turn, where, I mean, again, it was pretty obvious who's getting voted in, especially based on the previous episode's editing. And again, we end up getting Scott saying he thinks it's going to be 8-1, which, like, not quite. And also, why do you want it to be 8-1? And obviously, the optimal strat through this, when knowing that 2 teams were going in, is that you should be throwing your vote to someone else in the hopes that they end up coming in second. So again, the fact that Scott and Lori just seemed to just vote on Jonathan and Anna, just kind of hoping that Jonathan and Anna don't vote for them, seemed to be pretty misguided. But we do end up seeing multiple teams do the optimal strat and obviously split the vote onto Scott and Lori, to where, again, that's kind of what you should do. To where, again, Scott and Lori end up being really blindsided here, saying it's like their 8 sons voted against them, I guess. And definitely cast that they just met a few days ago is the equivalent to their 8 sons. Well, we have Scott saying that we're winning this leg, we're getting first, and we're not going home, that's for sure, which, again, surely. Though I'll say, I also do feel bad for Jonathan and Anna in this spot, where while obviously they did come off as a very domineering team to begin with, again, this is a spot where they're directly screwed over by that driver's seat, which just gave everyone just such an easy excuse to throw them in, which again, I think is probably the flaw of having this U-turn vote after that driver's seat situation, is the fact that it just puts such a massive bullseye on whoever gets that's max. But here we are seeing Jonathan and Anna talking about being betrayed by Carson and Jack, because again, I didn't expect that to come back up. For Carson and Jack to gloat about not getting a vote and that they're winning the social game, because we need more good content from them. While we have Anna, while we get the start of Jonathan just being a dick across this episode, telling Anna to stop whining and crying. But again, this ending up being a pretty big low point for Jonathan here. But anyway, we get to the detour right away, it being coconuts or coral. Coconuts being them delivering coconuts on a bike. Felt very physically taxing. While coral has them attaching 5 specific coral species to a reef star, and then they have to put it out in the ocean, which felt a lot easier, though they aren't explicitly told that they have to put the exact right coral on, which did lead to some teams losing time there. But either way, Scott and Lori end up deciding to do the coconuts first, while we see Jonathan and Anna do the opposite. Scott and Lori saying it's intentional, as they want to be able to recoup from the physical task while doing the coral. I feel like I personally would have wanted to do the opposite. I feel like it's actually better to recoup on your way to the next task rather than during an actual task. Again, as expected, we see Jonathan and Anna struggling on matching the coral, and then even then we get Anna freaking out about going into the water, which ends up to the point where Scott and Lori end up finishing the coconut task before Jonathan and Anna finish the coral one, which we end up seeing Carson and Jack leaving him first, and in the process telling Scott and Lori that the coral matter, which again should have been this big hint to give Scott and Lori a massive edge, only for them to just struggle with it anyway, constantly getting denied over and over again. Obviously, Jonathan and Anna being really exhausted by the time they even get to the coconut task, which I don't know what from, because coral didn't really have anything that involved true physicality. Now obviously again it is super hot outside, so I assume it's some sort of heat exhaustion, but again Jonathan in particular just seemed to be completely out of it through all of this. But again, Jonathan obviously seemed to be really struggling at this point, dropping his bike over and over again, talking about how his body's breaking down, he needs to take a rest, leading to a lot of bickering between the two here, with again just him coming off as a bit of a dick, saying that I'll go when I'm ready and that I can't run when I have a headache, which again did make him come off a bit pouty here. But despite that, Jonathan, Anna, and Scott and Lori actually end up finishing the detours around the same time here. Oh, well, we get a race for first here between Carson and Jack and Brett and Mark coming into the roadblock, which is paddling out on the surfboard and finding the board that has a matching decal to yours, which was kind of lame. But Carson and Jack here end up struggling with them making the mistake of looking for the board and not the sticker, leading to Brett and Mark ending up winning this leg. Oh, we see the typical Nick and Mike struggling, with them also struggling with the surfboard task and also getting lost along the way, which leads to Melinda and Erica passing them to the pit stop, them coming in 7th, which again, for a team like them, you would expect to do better. But either way, Jonathan and Anna end up having a slight edge coming into the roadblock, with Jonathan still breaking down and complaining about his headache and rests on the board and stops paddling back at a point after finding the right board, where again, it just felt like him completely breaking down, but he still ends up finishing the task before Scott does. With again, him just being a dick when he gets back to shore, just walking past Anna without talking to her. But either way, they end up arriving in 8th, with Jonathan coming to the realization that it's not possible to win every leg, which I will say, at least to Jonathan, again, from post-game stuff, he does seem to acknowledge his wrongdoings and thought out help for it, which I at least do credit him for, realize how he was acting was wrong. But either way, Scott and Lori end up coming in last and end up being a pretty shocking early elimination here. Again, Scott and Lori were a team that coming into this season, I was fully expecting to make a really deep run, especially considering how promoted they were. Again, I thought they were a shoo-in to make the finale. Again, they kind of get sniped out of the game in this spot. And again, I really like Scott and Lori on the show. I thought they were, again, kind of just perfect for modern Amazing Race. It's very competitive team that has a good backstory that kind of plays into their shtick as well, and one that again provide for some drama. Again, we saw Lori getting upset over the driver's seat and the U-turn vote. We see them come off as just a pretty endearing relationship where we never really see them get upset at each other. And in general, again, I just feel like they were kind of a perfect team for the Amazing Race, which again, if they ever do some sort of unfinished business season once again, I feel like they are a team that I would personally like to see on it. But with that, we then get to episode 6, which to me was one of the rougher episodes of the season, where I do think we get a pretty great ending. Outside that, again, a pretty slow episode, but everyone ends up having to fly to Dubai here, with everyone just getting on the same flight, which is obviously dull. Oh, we get an interaction here between Jonathan and Anna and Carson and Jack, with it being kind of awkward between two, but they end up apologizing. With, again, this highlighted focus on Carson and Jack and their relationships with the other teams felt very purposeful. But either way, in Dubai, we end up see them having to go to a desert gate, but along the way, we get focus on them seeing the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, to which we get a very humorous scene here of Brett and Mark thinking that's called the Wiz Khalifa and questioning what does Wiz Khalifa have to do with Dubai, which was really funny. Or just in general, Brett and Mark have a lot of these kind of dodo moments across the season. They definitely don't feel like the most traveled team in the world. But anyway, at the desert gate, they end up having to find cups. That puts them into groups with different release times, which are only 10 minutes apart, which is barely anything. And in the morning, they have to ride camels through the desert with Carson and Jack, obviously referencing Star Wars, because obviously they're nerds. Again, all boring. Oh, I followed up with a roadblock, which was skydiving, which was also boring. After that, we get the reveal of the Fast Forward. The Fast Forward's back on Amazing Race. Too bad the modern version of it sucks. I've always been a big proponent of the Fast Forward. I get why they don't have it anymore, as again, budgetary reasons, but I personally like the old school Fast Forward, the fact that there was always this choice that you could take the Fast Forward, and it was there every leg, and again, you have to plot out when exactly was the right time to do so. I think modern Amazing Race, with there only being 1 or 2 a leg, and that kind of ruins the point. At that point, it just makes it so, okay, a team's just going to have an easy ride to first, and obviously, again, you could potentially get this downfall to where they take the Fast Forward and still come in last, but again, most times than not, I do feel like modern Fast Forward is just extremely flawed in the fact that it just simply isn't that interesting. And this one in particular actually makes it even worse in the fact that there's not even a big fight to get the fast forward, where really the fast forward is determined like almost instantly, in that there is a orange luxury car in the parking lot outside that will take them to their destination, to where essentially the first team to get in gets the fast forward. Where again, it's very different to how it was back in the day where only one team could get it, but again, you would have to actually go to that destination, and again, it would be this like risk reward. But here they just hand it to them, and to be fair, I think that's probably purposeful, as I think they want to really guarantee someone does the fast forward. But again, it does end up really lessening the drama around it here. Or, though to be fair, we do end up seeing Han and Holden be the first to get out, and first the search for the car, only for them to pass it and Carson and Jack get it instead, which again feels pretty apt. But anyway, the fast forward itself ends up being scuba diving in this like fake sunken underwater city, which did look very cool, but also was very boring, very dragged out in the show, and also was very clearly commercial. But obviously Carson and Jack end up getting in first following that, which they say, if we're ever on the chopping block, we'll overcome it, which I wonder if that's foreshadowing. By the way, the other teams have to garnish a tea platter, which was also boring, though we do get some weird content here about the chef judge. We're talking about how hot he is, I guess. Oh, we also get focused around Pops and Jeff, who end up dropping their cake and have to redo theirs, with us also getting personal content between the two, which I did find pretty endearing, of Jeff talking about spending 24/7 with his dad as a kid and would cut trees with him and stay out of trouble, with Pops saying, "That's my boy." And again, I did really like the Pops and Jeff dynamic here. But anyway, we get to another roadblock here, which was also kind of dull, of them having to get on a motorized surfboard and get up on their feet along the way, which again, kind of dull. But either way, Han ends up doing extremely well here, being a surfer, and ends up leading to them coming in second, while Josiah ended up coming into the task in first, only to lose that lead, but still come in third. Ultimately, the leg does end up coming down to Pops and Jeff versus Nick and Mike, with Pops and Jeff being able to finish the roadblock in first, only for us to get this, again, really dramatic ending here, with it really just being neck and neck, where we do get this really tragic moment here of Jeff being unsure if the shuttle they're in front of is the right one, only for it to close the doors on them, and then to realize that it was the right one, meaning they lost out in 4 minutes, allowing Nick and Mike to catch up with them, leading to, again, a really interesting foot race here, with it starting off with both power walking through the station, which was funny, which I guess was supposedly because they weren't allowed to run. But anyway, we see them like following each other, trying to go through the same doors that were blocked. But ultimately, Nick and Mike end up winning out here in a foot race, with Pops being way behind. Again, I believe he did have some sort of foot injury, and also again, him being older just led to the fact that Nick and Mike just easily win this. Which again, I was kind of disappointed to lose Pops and Jeff here. I thought they were a very affable team. I thought a team that, again, definitely was always poised to be kind of like a mid-boots. They never really did extremely well in any particular leg, but they just felt like a team that came out very affable to me and won that. But they were just a team that I did find very endearing, and did find it humorous how much they would talk about how in shape Pops is for being 64. But in general, again, I thought they were a likable team here, but one that, again, never really poised for deep success. Either way, we then get to episode 7, the first self-driving leg of the race, which I'll be honest, I didn't even realize there wasn't one already. But anyway, it has them going to Bulgaria, with them all getting the same flight again, because that's boring. But here we end up seeing Erica really struggling with the map, saying that she's not of the generation that used maps, which is like, I mean, you're in your 30s. I'm younger than you. I remember when I was a kid, my parents were using maps, which again, I feel like you have at least looked at a map at some point. But either way, Nick and Mike end up being lost as usual, alongside Carson and Jack, which was actually a pretty big surprise here. Obviously, Carson and Jack, again, one of the most dominant teams up to this point, end up driving to where we get the reveal later that they're somehow 3 hours behind, which is kind of insane. Again, that is a spot where you should be pretty dead to rights. Again, that should have been this big death sentence for him. To be fair, most legs it probably is, but again, they get very fortunate in how this leg ends up being structured. But obviously also sets it up for them having this big underdog run, which was very obvious that it was going to work out for him. But anyway, Jonathan and Anna are arriving at the first task first, which has them delivering 2 crates of apples in a cart and then carrying another crate of apples, which was kind of dull. And that's followed up by a task of them going to a library and find a clue, aka the clue's literally just sitting on the bookshelf, where again, this is not really hidden at all. But either way, all pointless, leading up to the detour, really the main juice of this leg. The fact that it's a choice between haystack and woodstack. Haystack being a typical needle and haystack challenge that, again, felt very classic Amazing Race. All woodstack is just a very physical task of them transporting wood in a barrow, which is essentially just a more physical version of the apple task from earlier, which is, again, doing it again. Again, also would have been a perfect task for Pops and Jeff. I'm sure they were frothing in this moment. But also here we get the reveal of another double U-turn, but again, a more traditional one this time. Which again, nice to see U-turns back in the rotation. None of the early teams here end up using it. But we do end up seeing Alyssa and Josiah in the lead here, going for the haystack challenge and getting it pretty quickly. While Jonathan and Anna end up struggling, with Jonathan again coming off as a dick here, blaming it all on Anna, saying that you picked the wrong detour and you lost the lead for us, which again felt very icky, especially considering what we later see. But again, it does lead to a pretty fun Dodo moment of him saying that we always have the worst luck, only for Anna to then proceed to find it right away. But either way, this is all followed up by Jonathan and Anna trying to find their car, only to realize that they parked their car in a ditch somehow, where again Jonathan is the one parking it, which again he is the one to blame here. Yet despite that, again, we never see Anna criticize him for this and scold him in the way that Jonathan did with Anna, which never seeming to take responsibility for this being his fault, always talking about how it's just such bad luck, which is like not a great look here for Jonathan. Also, we do get a lot of focus here on how screwed they are if they can't get their car out, which I did question, like, can't they get a new car? Which we haven't seen as much recently, but it's like, again, I feel like they would have been fine either way. And considering Carson and Jack are 3 hours behind, I think either way they would have survived this leg. But either way, I mean, they end up getting locals to help them tow the car out anyway. So again, it ultimately doesn't matter too much, as again, they were probably coming in third either way. But again, it does lose them time on the offset. But the following we do end up seeing Nick and Mike arriving and knowing they're at the back of the pack, to which they end up doing the wood task. Who would have guessed that they do the very physical task? End up making up a lot of time here, again, passing up Paul and Holden, who are also doing the same thing. Also passing Melinda and Erica, who did the haystack challenge. But it does lead to a foot race to the U-turn between Nick and Mike and Melinda and Erica, with them all just seemingly assuming that they're in last, as again, there's no way that Carson and Jack would make a dumb mistake and get 3 hours behind. And who would have guessed it? Nick and Mike get lost on the way to the U-turn board. I never would have guessed that that's a thing that they would do. Leading to Melinda and Erica arriving first, and again, assuming that they need to U-turn somebody as they could be eliminated with all the teams being so close, they decide to U-turn Nick and Mike, which again, sound the call with the knowledge that they have. The problem is that they're obviously wrong. They did so for no reason, which in that world, yet obviously not the greatest move in the world. Again, obviously would have been a lot more beneficial to get Carson and Jack out of the race, but again, they didn't know that. But this ultimately obviously leads to Nick and Mike U-turning Han and Holden, which ends up really saving Carson and Jack here. Again, them really being saved from a complete misunderstanding where everyone just assumed that they're so good that there's no way they're in the back of the pack at this point, when again, clearly they were. When like, had they known that they were, obviously I think they would have been completely screwed here. But both Han and Holden and Nick and Mike end up really struggling at the hay task here, seemingly taking a very long time for both of them, with Nick and Mike really just bickering the entire time, and see them really rushing through the search to where clearly they had passed it along the way. And again, it just becomes a complete disaster for them, and thus even seeing a spot where they show us where the thing is, and it's on the other side of the field from where they're looking, where again, they just felt completely screwed there. But anyway, Alyssa and Josiah end up arriving at the farm for the roadblock, which is them having to milk a sheep and then sit with a 102-year-old woman and eat yogurt with her, which felt very weird. Also, weird to know about all this is the fact that it seemed like the teams during this leg were so far apart to where none of the teams were actually at this roadblock at the same time, which feels like a massive rarity there. But part of that's because Melinda and Erica, who would have guessed it, got lost along the way. Leading to Han and Holden, who again got U-turn, passing them, ending up in fourth. Oh, we finally have Carson and Jack arriving at the detour, to which again ends up being propped as this massive moment of them seeing that Nick and Mike are still there. This really being an episode that fully cemented me on the fact that I do think Carson and Jack are set up to win, as we really get so much focus on their perspective of things here. And it's about where I do think Carson and Jack also make the correct strategic move here, again, initially wanting to do haystack, but then switching at the moment that they see that Nick and Mike are stuck there, as again, considering how much of a disaster Nick and Mike back seem to be at this point, it was just more of a guarantee they could finish the wood task quicker, and they obviously do. But again, heroic music playing as they do so, and again, we get only a few minutes left of the episode by the time that Carson and Jack finish the detour, to get another big moment of them seeing that the U-turn's up ahead and them freaking out the fact that they're probably U-turn, only for them to obviously find out that they weren't, which again, another moment propped up as this big moment for them, with them obviously now knowing that they're going to survive this leg. But that's really just fast forwarding through the rest of the leg, with them ending up coming in sixth. Oh, and Nick and Mike never end up finishing the detour here. In a spot where they had previously talked about potentially giving up, taking the penalty and going on their own terms, but they do actually hold it out, to which Phil ends up showing up and eliminating them, which again felt very old school Amazing Race for this to specifically happen at a needle in the haystack stack challenge. And again, I think a pretty fitting way for Nick and Mike to go out. Again, these massive super fans of the race. But again, with that, we lose Nick and Mike, who I thought were a really fun team on this season. Again, they were a team that, again, you would expect to do very well. Again, they were like these two alpha guys that seemed pretty athletic. Again, the type of team that would dominate old school Amazing Race. Yet we just saw them be a bit of a disaster throughout this season. Again, bickering between each other constantly, being pretty mediocre at most tasks to where it seemed like they were only really good at these like very physical tasks. For anything else, they would kind of shut down during. And again, I thought they were really fun TV. For a team like them, which again, I don't typically find the most riveting on the race, I felt like they actually provide a lot of entertainment here just through how much of a disaster of a team they end up being in a spot where, again, you would not have expected that coming into it. But then we get to episode 8, an episode that just further cemented the Carson Jack winner edit, with them literally focusing the entire previously on Carson Jack's comeback and saying, "Can they do it again?" Which again just felt so blatant that we're supposed to be primarily focusing on their arc across this season. But anyway, we end up having them now go to Sofia, Bulgaria, with the entire leg again taking place in the same country, with again there not being an equalizer along the way, which obviously adds to the impressiveness of Carson and Jack's comeback. But we do get the reveal at the beginning of the leg here that the twist for this leg is the fact that Express Pass is available once again, but this time actually using the format that I previously talked about, where again, instead of them handing it out at a roadblock that you have to do twice, they actually do have a separate task this time, which again, I personally like better, even though to be fair, this one was just kind of lame, kind of easy. And Alyssa and Josiah were 20 minutes ahead of any other team, to where obviously it wasn't really much of a risk for them, and we see every other team just not even try to go for it, considering how far ahead Alyssa and Josiah are, to where again, kind of lame how it all played out. But the task itself ends up being a pretty basic one of them just having to walk over coals barefoot, which again, we do get hype about how Josiah hates hot things, which again felt very insulting to Alyssa. But we do get a funny moment of him saying, I'm on a beach, as he crosses it, which again felt very ridiculous. But anyway, they easily finish and end up still coming into the next task in second, which ultimately probably a risk worth taking for them. But it does also lead to Alyssa and Josiah getting personal content here, talking about needing the money for their personal loans and wanting to start a family, which talk about how it's about winning the war, which I will say at this point, again, even though I was pretty convinced that Carson and Jack were ultimately going to win, I did feel like Alyssa and Josiah were the only other viable winner contenders at this point, where everyone else just felt kind of dead from an editing perspective. But anyway, we end up having Jonathan pouting once again here, being upset that they can't go for the Express Pass, as the previous leg has screwed them over because they were stuck in a ditch for an hour, which again, I wonder whose fault that is. Oh, we get some very ominous content from Melinda and Erica saying that last leg was rough and that they don't want to be in last, only for them to get lost instantly and going beyond where the map is, and them starting to bicker over it. And again, I wonder where this is all going to lead. Oh, we end up seeing Carson and Jack leaving the start about an hour behind Melinda and Erica, again, the 5th place team, to where, again, certainly adds their underdog story, but again, kind of makes it pretty insane they're able to make up that much time over the course of this leg, considering how tight this leg ends up being. But anyway, we end up seeing Brett and Mark remain in the lead really the entire leg from the point that Alyssa and Josiah go for the Express Pass, to where they end up pretty easily winning the leg with no real difficulties. But again, really most of this leg does come down to them essentially just running around the city, where we do get a first task here that was kind of boring, of them being part of some sort of festival that has them throwing a cross into the lake and they have to retrieve it, which was again just really easy and really boring. But again, from that point forward, they're not allowed to take a taxi and they have to go on foot or use public transportation, which added a bit of an interesting dynamic to this leg, but also led to them just kind of just running from place to place a lot, which I thought was kind of lazy from a leg design perspective, where we had multiple places that they were told to go to that they didn't do anything at, like this collect shop, which was kind of a cool thing, and this like underground shop that was like hidden and they had to find it, which did actually lead to some fun content from the fact that teams struggled to find it to begin with and would run past it, but ultimately, again, not much of a task. But at least there's some great content from Melinda and Erica in particular, with them spending a while trying to find it and us getting, again, more bickering between the two, with them also being pretty doomed in this leg from the very beginning, where we see them read the clue that tells they can't travel by taxi and read it as that they have to travel by taxi, which again, it finally leads to them saying, thank God, which again, pretty much doomed them from the very beginning, as again, even if they did get to the end in a reasonable time, they would have a penalty that would probably be larger than the gap between them and Carson and Jack at this point. And it just made this leg pretty predictable from this point forward, which is obvious that Melinda and Erica were going home, as again, they weren't doing particularly well to begin with. Plus, also now we're going to have a penalty from taking a taxi. Or, there's again, I think from a results perspective, that it leads to part of this episode feeling a bit lame. But again, at least it's a great downfall for them. We get a lot of Dodo content here, with them instantly saying, I hope someone makes big bigger mistakes than us, and later ends up saying that we've gotten better because we're now focused on reading the clue, which was very ironic to say that in particular. But either way, we also get focused on Carson and Jack, who end up properly reading their clue and do end up going on a bus, which they end up seeing the wood chopper guy from the previous leg, the judge for the wood detour, which was very weird. That they just stumbled upon this guy, and he ends up helping them out, telling them where the Kleck shop is and what it is. This is very strange. But anyway, the following task ends up having teams go to the Sophia University Library, where they have to decipher acrylic into English. Another, again, seemingly boring task, but one that was actually made kind of interesting here through the fact that most teams struggled with figuring out how to use the cipher, with them not realizing that the English was on the bottom and them just being confused at what they were supposed to do. With us even seeing Alyssa and Josiah looking around the entire room, only not find anything, to the point where Jonathan and Anna end up arriving following that, and end up solving it pretty quickly, with us finally seeing Jonathan standing in the way so they can't see them looking at the back, leading to them finishing ahead of them, only for them to then proceed to tell Josiah and Alyssa about it, which I was surprised they did, considering, again, they're clearly being shown as these villainous sort of characters, yet realistically, I think when looking at their actual runs, they don't really actually do anything too villainous to the other teams, to which, again, they do get hyped up as using this to gain social capital for down the road, but I do feel like it's a spot where this is definitely an unnecessary move, and one that, again, probably doesn't help them anyway, as we see what the next task is, which is to go to a sculpture garden, which, again, was just pointless. Literally just them going there and having to go to another location, which ends up being the location of the roadblock, which was a boring dancing task that, again, didn't add much to the show, but again, it ends up being funny because Jonathan and Anna end up getting lost along the way, leading to Josiah and Alyssa surpassing them anyway, ending up landing in second. But ultimately, the race does come down to the final three teams here of Han and Holden, Melinda and Erica, and Carson and Jack, with Han and Holden and Melinda and Erica working together at the library, thinking they have a decent lead on Carson and Jack, only for Carson and Jack to arrive and instantly figure the cipher out, with Holden seeing them figure it out and leading to them working together, with Han and Holden literally just lying to Melinda and Erica's faces, which felt very strange considering what they later do, but where they could have just outright screwed over Melinda and Erica in this spot. But they decided to essentially do what Jonathan and Anna did and then tell Melinda and Erica as they leave, to the point where Holden even proceeds to tell them the beginning of the phrase, which felt insane. Probably would have told them more had Han not shut it down, but again, felt like a very misguided move there. Again, definitely put them in a lot of danger. Again, theoretically, considering the taxi thing would have eliminated them anyway. But following this, we end up seeing Han and Holden and Carson and Jack working together, as again, they just need to avoid last place, only for Carson and Jack to stop for directions, while Han and Holden feel confident they know where they're going. And what do you know? They don't know where they're going, and Carson and Jack end up surpassing them, coming in fourth. But really, none of this mattered. It was very obvious that Melinda and Erica were coming in last here. This spot where I did find it funny how before even telling them they're eliminated, they do proceed to also tell them that they broke the rules by taking taxis. But again, it wouldn't have mattered. They were going to be eliminated anyway. There was just really no suspense through the back portion of this episode. But with that, again, we lose Melinda and Erica, who I thought were, again, another affable team here. Kind of likable, did bring some drama at points. We see some bickering between the two, especially in these later episodes when we get to the self-driving leg, which I thought was pretty interesting. They also have a pretty interesting downfall, even though, again, it was very obvious where the result was going. I did feel like we got a decent amount of Dodo content along the way that actually made it kind of fun as well. They did spend a decent amount of time hyping up how they are the best female team of the season, so at least that's something. But ultimately, again, just kind of a fine team, very Apple, very Pops and Jeff coded, and the fact that they were a likable team, but just one that never felt particularly poised to end up ultimately winning the season. But now for episode 9, where them flying to Naples, Italy, with a lot of hype of how this is the first time in the Amazing Race they've gone there, which thank God. And we see them booking all their flights on the Expedia app, to which they all get on the same flight, which was obviously still very lame. But we do get a lot of setup early on in the episode of Will, Alyssa, and Josiah use their express pass, which, spoiler, they won't, so that was kind of pointless. But we see all the teams pretty much being together as they head for the first location, it being a fortress. So we see most of the teams end up running the wrong way, while Han and Holden, Jonathan and Anna end up being the first to find the right location, taking a lead, only for them to then blow that lead by getting lost on the way to the detour, which put them in the back anyway. All we see the other three teams get to the detour all in a row, a detour between mandolin and mozzarella, which, again, doesn't rhyme or doesn't even sound anything close to each other, except for just that they start with an M. But mandolin is them having to piece together a mandolin, how shocking, while mozzarella has them braiding mozzarella. Again, who would have guessed that? Most end up going for the mozzarella task, which I could see on paper that feeling like the easier task, as all you have to do is obviously just braid it a certain way and make sure it's certain weights. Though I do see a lot of teams really struggling here in a spot where the mandolin task is one that only Jonathan and Anna end up doing. It's one where it really just felt like you just following instructions and it not being particularly difficult, just maybe more time sensitive than, again, just doing the mozzarella in the first go, but at the same time, again, most teams don't. So realistically, I think, again, a mostly balanced detour here that does lead to Jonathan getting content about how the mandolin task was made for him. He does this at home, I guess, and him and Anna end up moving up one spot through this. While Han and Holden end up coming into the mozzarella task in last, and he ended up struggling even more there, with Han talking about insecurities and that she can't braid them right, only for him to find out that's actually easier than they expected, which actually does lead to a pretty funny moment as they're shocked at how many of their braids end up getting improved, with Han saying, "We're not even bad, bro." Anyway, most teams seem to be pretty close together as they end up leaving the detour, only for most teams to get lost once again, leading to John and Anna taking back the lead. The next task being grocery shopping, which was kind of boring, as it felt like a pretty simple task, and just go to 3 shops in the area, buy specific items. No one seemed to have any true difficulty here, and everyone kind of leaves in the same placement. But now they have to end up finding a marked car that has them being driven to a nearby restaurant, the location of the roadblock. But on the way there, we see Jonathan and Anna blow their lead again, getting passed by Brett and Mark on the way to the car, and then Carson and Jack just passed them on the drive there. To where, despite this very rocky leg here, we never see Jonathan and Anna actually getting upset at each other this time, which again was a nice change of pace. The roadblock here has them having to make a pizza from scratch, even though I believe they were just given the dough and had to stretch it out, so it's not really from scratch. But there was some fun content here from Mark being previously upset at how they can't eat all the food while they're there, only for people not doing the roadblock being given a pizza to eat along with all the other failed pizzas, which I found funny that they literally just said, "Hey, here's the scraps." Also funny that, like, at the end of this task, they end up taking the pizza they made and have to deliver it to Phil in a spot where they don't get to eat the pizza themselves, and it goes to, like, the band that was there at the pit stop, which I will say, if I was on the race, I'll be pretty annoyed in this spot, especially if I was the one doing the roadblock. The fact that I was around all this pizza and couldn't eat any of it. But either way, we see Anna ending up blowing through this task with a lot of talk about how she worked at Domino's as a teenager and she's made thousands of pizzas. So again, she ends up getting out really quick here and easily ends up winning the leg. And what was again a very up and down leg for Jonathan and Anna, but one that I think made them come off as pretty endearing here. All I did love this moment as Brett ends up finishing the roadblock of us seeing Mark trying to say something to the group, only for him to say, "Who cares what I was going to say? I'm gone," and just rushes out of there, which was funny. But I did find the judge for the pizza task here to be kind of funny, in that it was clearly the owner of the shop and someone who was very protective of his oven and had these like freakouts when Alyssa got her pizza stuck inside of it and even like reach her hands into it, which felt again very unsafe. But either way, they still end up coming out of this in third in a spot where we then get Josiah going back and forth in puns with Phil, which was weird. Anyway, we see Carson ending up doing the roadblock, as Jack had already done 5, and if Carson didn't do this one, then Jack would run it for the rest of the race. And they decide on Carson, despite the fact that he's the worst cook. And yeah, he kind of sucked here with him having to do the task over and over and over again, but thankfully they obviously had a massive lead at this point. So he finishes just as Han and Holden end up arriving, where again, it didn't seem particularly close, even though the edit tried to make it seem like it was close, with Han and Holden seemingly getting the pizza task on their first try, and back and forth as they're running to the pit stop, even though clearly it was a pretty big gap there. And again, Han and Holden coming last. But in this season of surprises, we get the reveal that this leg is a non-elimination leg, and that's the surprise for the leg, which is bad. Again, it's really lame. Which I guess it is sticking true to, again, it being a surprise and the fact they're bringing back twists from previous seasons, but it's also one that's like, again, this is the one you brought back. But to be fair, I do like Han and Holden, so again, it's not like the worst result in the world, but I did love how they're like using this twist as an excuse to bring back a non-elimination leg here. But now for episode 10, where we have them flying to Frankfurt and we have them booking their own tickets, only for that to not matter and everyone get the same flight. So that was really lame. And they arrive in Frankfurt only to then take a train to Strasbourg, France, which felt very weird. And I do question, like, was this literally just here just for the sake of having a trick question at the following task? But either way, we do get very good personal content here from Carson and Jack, talking about what they would do with the money in a spot where, at this point, it was clearly between them and Alyssa and Josiah for who would win. Though I think the fact that we got this, like, very, like, out of the blue personal content for Carson and Jack in a spot where it's not even like they have that great of a story of what they would use the money for. Where, again, it felt weird that we were seeing this, which, again, made me feel more confident in the fact that they were going to go on to win. Anyway, it ends up being a self-driving leg, with them first having to drive to the Council of Europe building, where Mark and Brett end up getting super lost on the way there, to where they end up spending most of the leg in last because of it, though funnily it doesn't end up becoming a death knell for them. But I did love this like little moment of Mark just singing that we can't be the only ones who got lost like over and over again, with Brett just in the background making a really funny face to this. But either way, Jonathan and Anna are the first to get to the building. They'll have to wait for it to open, only for Carson and Jack to pass them, despite arriving in third. Being the first to enter the room of the task in a spot where you can only have one team in there at a time for some reason. I really don't know why, but it leads to them having to answer again a trick question of what are the 4 countries on the Council of Europe that you've been to, with again Germany being one of them because they landed in Germany for a few seconds. Really only Alyssa and Josiah end up stumbling on this. But anyway, we then get to the twist of the episode, that being the head-to-head, which I have always thought it was an interesting concept in the show, though Amazing Race US uses it in a weird way in the fact that it's like the final thing in the leg and it's what determines who goes home or not, which I always found that to be a tad lame. Where I do like the fact that you can, again, obviously come in last and still recover from that. That's something that we've seen on like Amazing Race Canada, and yeah, they end up using that format here. Mind you, I still feel like it came off pretty dull, where the challenge itself just ends up being water jousting, and we get so much wasted time on seeing them prepare for it, which is, like, again, so boring. But also, again, was just so quick and doesn't really lead to anything special, where really all the teams end up leaving in the same order they arrived. And I do think this ends up actually helping out Brett and Mark, or while they do end up losing to Alyssa and Josiah at the end, the fact that obviously Alyssa and Josiah had to wait for them to get there, and ultimately they only get a 10-minute penalty for coming in last. It actually probably ends up helping them in the race here. But anyway, Hunt and Holden end up being the first to leave here, where I will say also surprising that Hunt and Holden did not have a speed bump on this leg, which I guess is like very old school of them. But the fact that they just get the race unfettered here is pretty surprising. But it does lead to them going to a cheese shop where they have to memorize and recite cheese names, which I feel like we've seen this task before. But it does end up taking teams a really long time, to where all the teams end up catching back up. We end up seeing all the teams there at once, with Alyssa saying that we should use our express pass instantly as we'd be first, only for Josiah to say no, which was a very bad move here. I think this was the obvious play. I think Alyssa was right. Again, Josiah fighting against this, again, I think was just so misguided, where she accurately reads the fact that, again, the other teams being here that were 40 minutes ahead of them means that's probably going to take them around 40 minutes to do this, which again would give them a pretty big lead. They were able to just skip this task entirely, but instead they end up trying to do it and they end up struggling through it to the point where all the teams but Brett and Mark end up leaving before they eventually end up using the express pass, which is, again, really the worst of all worlds, where it really just feels like such a waste there, where I do think they pretty easily win the leg had they been able to finish in this spot. But this then also ends up leading to some very questionable content here from Jonathan, who's upset at Anna for being the one to get the names wrong during the memory task. That leads to them leaving in third, and just leads to Jonathan just being very pissy for the rest of the leg, with him really just pouting and just seemingly not helping her with really anything and not helping her navigate. Again, we see her trying to get instructions and he's just in the background upset at her for taking too long, tells her to be quiet and tells her that she's a terrible partner. And again, all this was very icky, which again, credit to Jonathan post-show for seemingly recognizing this. But again, I think this is kind of like teetering on the edge to the point where it's just kind of uncomfortable to watch. But either way, the next task has them climb to the top of a cathedral just because, and it then leads to them having to drive 45 minutes to do the detour, which I don't know why it was so far away. Like, I find it very strange they were like told the details of the detour but then had to drive so far to get there. But it's because it ends up being one where the detours were actually not side by side, which again I feel like is very rare in Modern Amazing Race. But the choice ends up being between Out to Dry, where they have to clean laundry by hand, or For the Birds, of them creating a nest for storks, which was pretty boring. And also, very clearly, the laundry task here was much easier. The top 3 teams all end up picking the laundry task. Alyssa and Josiah and Brett and Mark go to the nest task, in a spot where pretty much every team here gets extremely lost along the way, leading to a very dynamic leg here, outside of Carson and Jack, who are just in first the entire time and easily win the leg, which is a pretty good comeback for them, considering it had actually been a while since they had a pretty clean leg. But again, really funny that this leads to pretty much every team thinking that they're in last, in a spot where it did add a lot of urgency to how the others were racing. But we do see Brett and Mark again jump from last to second coming into the detour, which is pretty insane. Again, they had this potential to come back there, only for Alyssa and Josiah to finish the task first. And we get a lot of focus here on them getting instructions, with Brett and Mark initially going to the same people to ask for instructions, only to then say screw it and decide to just follow Alyssa and Josiah, which obviously, again, if they were able to do so successfully and again get to a foot race with them, they probably do win. But the problem is that they failed to follow them to begin with, which felt like a pretty fatal mistake here of them just ending up lost once again, with Alyssa and Josiah somehow coming in second, which was pretty mind-blowing, where even they had thought that they were eliminated when they went up, with Josiah saying that we used the express pass right, which is I don't know about that. But again, this is all while Brett and Mark are nowhere to be seen anymore, leading to us seeing Han and Holden get stuck at the laundry task, where throughout the entire leg, they had been talking about this concept of realizing that they don't have to be perfect and good enough is good enough, only for them to fail at the laundry task because they did what was just to them good enough. But at least the Jonathan and Anna passing them, coming in third, with Han and Holden coming in a close fourth here, Brett and Mark arriving in last, with a really roller coaster of a leg there. And with, again, we lose Brett and Mark, who I thought were pretty fun in the show. Again, initially I thought they were kind of duds. I didn't really feel like they brought that much. But by the end, I thought they had like a pretty decent share of character moments, especially from Mark in particular. And while I feel like they were the team of the final five that were meant to probably have the least amount of investment in, I ultimately felt like they had a pretty decent role on this season, even though, again, I do think they are probably overshadowed by some of these more explosive teams. But again, I thought they had a pretty endearing relationship to where I do think they ultimately come off as pretty likable on the show. But now for episode 11, which I thought was probably the worst episode of the season. I thought was a really boring one. One that we don't even get the elimination by the end, which was very strange. But we have them flying to Portugal, where they have to book their own flights. But again, everyone just gets on the same flight anyway. But we get the reveal of the twist for the round, that being valet roulette, a random draw of if they get an automatic or a manual car, which was really lame. Like, who cares? Like, I get that. Again, there are times that teams really struggle with manual driving, but like, it's also like, who cares? Like, this really feels like they were like out of ideas and just like, okay, well, we need a twist for this leg, so it's just like a random thing we can do here. Again, how shocking that Carson and Jack get very lucky and they get automatic. I never would have guessed that. But again, they end up being in first, really the entire leg, getting to the first task of them having to raft across the river and then roll barrels uphill, which was, again, really boring. Outside of seeing Alyssa and Josiah struggling while paddling and arguing with each other, which again was very rare for them. This is all we see Jonathan and Anna getting lost on the way to the first task and end up being in last for really most of the leg, with Jonathan again just coming off very pouty, complaining about how annoying she is. But anyway, we get to the roadblock, which was an archery task of them having to dress up in medieval armor, and obviously Carson and Jack make a meal of this. How they're living out their fantasy, but either way, kind of funny that this is essentially just an easier version of the ninja task from earlier, where they just have to land 3 out of 7 shots, which again did not seem particularly difficult. But that takes us to the final task of the leg, that being them having to assemble a tile puzzle and then plaster it on the wall, which was again also kind of boring. Though they have to take a train to get there, with Carson and Jack and Han and Holden getting on the same one, ending up landing in first and second, respectively. Oh, well, Jonathan and Anna end up catching up to Alyssa and Josiah, catching the second train, which does lead to this kind of funny moment of like Alyssa and Josiah being pissed at seeing them. Always see Jonathan and Anna just arguing in the background, but ultimately, Jonathan and Anna end up finishing the puzzle first. They seem to have a pretty sizable lead, only for them to start putting it on the wall, and Jonathan ends up dropping a tile, and we get a cliffhanger. What a shit cliffhanger. Which is really funny, is this is literally solved within the first 5 minutes of the next episode. We literally see the fact that like Jonathan just has to piece the towel back together and they're not giving a replacement anyway, and they're just allowed to go through anyway, landing in third. And while the edit really much tried to seem like they were super close, it didn't seem like that was the case, considering Jonathan and Anna were gone by the time Alyssa and Josiah end up arriving. So again, Alyssa and Josiah come in last, end up being eliminated. Alyssa and Josiah, again, I thought were a very likable team. Again, like they obviously have this like dynamic of like Alyssa being the logical one, while Josiah being this more like comedic presence who'd make puns constantly. But again, I think they were both fine on the show. I feel like they're pretty much like the team that you would expect Amazing Race to like in the modern day. And again, they were pretty competent at the race. Again, they got fairly unlucky in this final leg. Now again, obviously still prone to mistakes, and they did get fairly unlucky in this final leg that Jonathan and Anna were able to catch up at the very end. But ultimately, again, just a very affable team by the end. But with that, we then get to the final leg, where they have to fly to Miami and all get on the same flight again. So that's great. With Carson and Jack being given first-class tickets for coming in first in the previous leg, which really doesn't matter. But also we see them all getting on a speedboat, and they're having this like Miami Vice-style music playing, which again clearly felt like what they were going for. But most of the leg ends up comprising of the final twist of the season, the return of the scramble, which again, I've always thought the scramble was a really cool concept, and I like seeing it for the final leg here. I think it makes a lot of sense to do it here. Again, 3 tasks you have to complete around the city. All of these you gain pieces of the following clue. Again, a cool concept. An issue is the fact that this ultimately doesn't matter, as every team just does everything in the exact same order, as I feel like there's a very clear path to be taking throughout all this, where it would have been more interesting if like all the locations were around the same distance. Yeah, instead it just again felt like every team was just going to go to the one that was closest to them, leading to, again, it being kind of linear and also just kind of ruins the point of the scramble. But anyway, we see Carson Jack being the lead for really most of the leg. The only time they're not is on the way to the first task here. Jonathan and Anna ending up beating them there, coming out of it in first, a task of them having to save a victim using a watercraft, which was, again, just kind of boring. Though it leads to a lot of talk about how Anna is struggling because it involves the water, where I do think they do get very unfortunate the fact that this final leg here ends up literally just being 3 water tasks back to back to back, which definitely did not favor Jonathan and Anna in this spot. But we did get a funny little moment here of them having to push the vehicle into the water, only for Anna to be on it before they're in the water, with the instructor getting annoyed at her. But ultimately, Jonathan and Anna end up blowing their lead anyway here in a spot where they end up trying to go for the detour that the others don't go to first, despite not knowing where it is, leading to being lost and eventually giving up and going back to that second task and blowing their lead. And really, they end up being in last from that point forward. But we do get to the second task, which has them having to soar, which is just them gliding in the water for 60 seconds, which did seem fairly difficult. And it was a roadblock here, with Han being very overconfident, saying that she's a surfer and that they can take the lead, only for Jack to end up finishing first, and Han to take multiple attempts, with her clearly being disappointed in herself while leaving, with, again, it feeling pretty clear that Carson Jack had a significant enough lead to where they were likely going to win at this point. But this is all while Anna ends up being the one to do the task here, with them assuming it was a heights challenge, which, again, just further screws her. Again, it's obviously all in the water, but she does get strong content here about overcoming her fears. And again, I thought this is a pretty endearing way to end the Jonathan and Anna arc on this season. The fact that Jonathan is very supporting of her once she finishes, again, not coming off as a dick, which, again, shows some development there, but ultimately they end up being in last for really the rest of the leg. Oh, we see the final task in the scramble here being to sail a boat around Mark buoys, which was, again, also kind of boring and causes no placement changes. But from the 3 clues here, we see them being tasked to go to Domino Park just to pick up a clue and be told to go to a movie studio for the final task, which, again, that was kind of a pointless aspect of it. The final task here ends up being a massive puzzle where they have to spell out Amazing Race and then put pictures of the locations in front of them in order while also putting the twist in order. A seemingly pretty easy task here where, again, the memorization part was relatively easy. Obviously, you just have to memorize the order of the twist. Outside of that, the locations didn't matter as much as, again, they all were sized for the letters. So, again, you know the order for most of them as you know how to spell Amazing Race. But really, the most difficult aspect of this was just a basic puzzle putting together the letters of the Amazing Race. But again, ultimately, Carson Jack coming out in first. Again, have a pretty easy win here, despite there being a fake out here of them getting lost, but ultimately they win. Oh, while Han and Holden actually lose even more time by Han getting into a car accident, which ultimately doesn't matter much as, again, the guy just lets them go anyway. But obviously, again, certainly didn't help their case. And beyond that, you can clearly tell just how defeated they felt in confessional, to where, again, I think it was pretty clear they were losing. So they ultimately come in second, while, again, Jonathan and Anna end up being a good chunk behind in last. But again, I thought Carson Jack winning the season was a fine enough conclusion to the season. Again, a kind of predictable result for the season, where I feel like Carson Jack just feel like a typical winning Amazing Race team. Again, racers that are pretty competent at everything, given a very positive edit, very likable dynamic, which, again, I pretty much had them pegged as the winner since pretty much the premiere, where it really was only Alyssa and Josiah that could have combated that. But I just felt like the Carson Jack win was very predictable, but it was still a fun enough ride there. Though, again, it wasn't really in doubt by the time we got to this final leg. But with that, again, we got 3 teams to still talk about, so let's talk about them. First, starting off with Jonathan and Anna, who I, for the most part, loved on this season. Jonathan and Anna felt like a very old-school Amazing Race team, and it was fun to see that dynamic brought back to a race. Mind you, again, I do think there were points where it got a bit too icky. I think seeing them bicker for a lot of the race was fine, and seeing, like, Jonathan's poutiness at points. But again, I do think certain comments he made towards Anna were, again, just not fun. But again, at least credit to Jonathan, the fact that he seems to have recognized his faults post-show. Where, again, Jonathan and Anna were probably the most entertaining team on the season, where, again, if they do a returning season in the near future, I would personally like to see them back, though I'm not 100% sure on how they feel about the negativity they brought to the show. But then we move on to Han and Holden, who I also really liked on the show. I'm actually shocked that they got second. I feel like that was not really on my bingo card, as I felt like Jonathan and Anna very much felt more like the second place, like Colin Christie sort of team, while Han and Holden, again, had a very rocky leg, and I think one of the worst track records for a team that made it to the final leg. Yet despite that, man, kind of almost pulled out the win. I think it's really, if they finish that second task earlier and Han doesn't get in a car accident, they probably do have a good shot to pull this out here. But ultimately, again, very inconsistent racers, but really fun TV. Again, I think Han and Holden were another highlight of the season, just with how much bickering they would have between the two. So I thought they had a really fun sibling dynamic here that also make them a team that I personally would like to see back down the road. And finally, let's talk about the winners, and Carson and Jack, who, again, obviously very strong racers. Again, had that lull with getting super lost at that one point, but really outside that, again, really had a lot of skills for the game, especially Jack. I feel like Jack just felt like someone that was pretty much good at everything. So again, very strong racers, very good track record. Again, a pretty solid average placement, especially considering that like 2-leg stretch where there was no true equalizer between it, to where, again, I think very impressive racers. Also, likable presences on the show. I'll say they get a bit grating to me, just how many like nerdy references they would make. So I didn't love that by the end, but clearly, again, a very likable team. One that just, again, very much feels embodying of what Amazing Race is currently going for. So while they were not my personal favorite team on this season, I do think they are satisfying winners here, both from a race and a narrative perspective. But with that, again, that's the end of Amazing Race 37. And again, my general thoughts on the season are that I thought it was good. I thought it was a pretty solid modern Amazing Race season. Again, does it live up to the old school seasons of the show? No. But there definitely were some old school feeling moments on this season. There was some drama within teams and between teams at points, along with the fact that it was just a pretty solidly consistent season of the show. For a while, I do very much doubt that we would reach the high points that Amazing Race had in the past with its current format. I do feel like this is a step in the right direction to at least be, again, a decent enough show and not be Amazing Race 36. But with that, those are my thoughts on Amazing Race 37. Obviously, I'll be back for Amazing Race 38 at the end of the year, where, and I was never not covering that based on what we know about it. Also beyond that, obviously, we have Survivor 48 ending very soon. I'll be doing videos on that. Also, we got the Survivor 50 cast coming very soon, where, again, expect videos on that as well. Where, again, got a lot of stuff coming up in the near future. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.